Ethan Sinclair was the epitome of perfection. A self-made billionaire, a devoted husband, a loving father. He was charming, gentle, and generous, the kind of man every woman dreamed of having. To the world, he was flawless. But beneath the polished exterior lay a darkness no one suspected. For 25 years, Ethan had lived with a single burning purpose: to find the men who had brutally massacred his family when he was just a boy. The night of the attack had been etched into his mind like a nightmare that refused to fade. His father, mother, and little sister had been slaughtered in cold blood, their screams still haunting his dreams. Hidden beneath the floorboards, he had watched the horror unfold, powerless and broken. That night had created two versions of Ethan, the one the world admired and the one who lurked in the shadows, hunting down the ghosts of his past. For years, he had tracked them down one by one, ensuring they met the same fate they had inflicted upon his family. Each name crossed off his list brought him closer to the end. Only one name remained, the mastermind behind the massacre. His hunt was finally coming to an end. Under the cover of darkness, he executed his final kill with the same precision that had made him invisible for years. His target, a wealthy, respected businessman, never saw it coming. There was no struggle, no mistakes. Justice had been served. But as Ethan searched the room for any final clues, his gaze landed on a family portrait resting on the desk. The sight of the familiar faces made his blood run cold. His hands trembled as he reached for the photograph, dread sinking into his bones. The man he had just killed was Jonathan Hale, his father-in-law, Claire's beloved father. A shuddering breath escaped Ethan's lips. His mind raced. How could this be? How had he missed this? The man he had spent years hunting, the monster who had stolen everything from him, had been the same man who had welcomed him into his family, the grandfather of his children, the man who had once called him son. Memories collided in his mind. Jonathan laughing at the dinner table, playing with Claire as a child, holding Ethan's own son in his arms. And then, overlaid with those moments, the screams from that night, the blood, the terror. Justice had been served, but the cost was unbearable. Ethan stood frozen in the room, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like an avalanche. He had imagined this moment countless times, but never like this. This was not the victory he had envisioned. The sound of Claire's scream tore through the house, wrenching him from his thoughts. He watched from the shadows as she fell to her knees beside her father's lifeless body, her wails of grief like a dagger to his soul. He had taken everything from her, just as Jonathan had taken everything from him. He tried to convince himself that Jonathan had deserved it, that he had been a monster. But the truth was undeniable. Jonathan had been more than that. He had been a father, a grandfather, a man who was loved deeply by his family. And now, Ethan had left behind the same pain he had spent his life trying to erase. For weeks, Ethan lived in torment, watching as Claire fell apart. The warmth of their home turned to ice. The love in her eyes dimmed. She was broken, and he was the cause. And then the final blow came. Through her grief, Claire made a vow. Whoever did this, I will never stop until I find them. Ethan's heart shattered. The woman he loved, the woman he had promised to protect, would spend the rest of her life hunting for him. He could not undo what he had done, but he could stop the cycle. One stormy night, he walked into the police station, his hands trembling as he approached the front desk. The officer looked up, surprised by the presence of a man so revered in society. Ethan took a deep breath, his voice steady but hollow. I'd like to confess to a murder. As he sat in the cold, dark cell, staring at the walls, he realized the truth. Justice had been served. The monster was gone. The boy who had lost everything had avenged his family. But in doing so, he had become the very thing he had hunted. Days later, Claire found a letter waiting for her. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the paper, her breath hitching as she recognized Ethan's handwriting. You once told me you'd love me forever, no matter who I was. I hope that's true, because the man you married, the man you trusted, was never real. He was built from the ashes of a broken boy who only knew pain and vengeance. I have no right to ask for your forgiveness. I only ask that you find peace. Love always, Ethan." Tears streamed down Claire's face as she clutched the letter to her chest. But amidst the sorrow, something else stirred within her. A whisper of realization, a storm of emotions. And then, her lips parted as she whispered the chilling words that would set everything into motion once more. "I will find the truth." Claire had spent her life believing in the goodness of people. She had trusted her father with unwavering faith, just as she had trusted Ethan. Now, both men had betrayed her. One with secrets buried in blood, the other with the blade that had ended it all. She was drowning in contradictions. Her father, the man she had adored, had been a murderer, and her husband, the man she had trusted with her soul, had been the executioner. Which truth was more unbearable? The world saw Ethan as a monster now, but she had known his touch, his warmth. Had that been a lie, or had she simply been too blind to see what lay beneath? Fueled by grief, Claire devoted herself to uncovering every detail of her father's past. The deeper she dug, the darker the truth became. Her father had been involved in more than just her husband's tragedy. He had orchestrated bloodshed, ruined families, built an empire on bones. And yet, she still loved him, just as she still loved Ethan. Her mind warred against itself. Should she condemn Ethan for delivering justice? Or condemn herself for not seeing her father's sins? One evening, Claire visited the prison. Ethan looked up from the cold, steel bench, his once commanding presence reduced to nothing. Yet, when he saw her, his eyes still held warmth. "You shouldn't be here," he said, voice hollow. "I need to know the truth," she whispered, gripping the metal bars between them. "All of it." Ethan hesitated, then nodded. He told her everything, the years of hunting, the pain, the revenge. And for the first time, Claire saw him not as the man she loved, nor the murderer society now condemned, but as the lost boy he had once been. She left the prison that night with the weight of 2 lives pressing down on her shoulders. Justice had been served, but justice had also destroyed her family. The dilemma was unbearable. And then, a revelation struck her like a blade to the chest. If her father had been capable of such horrors, who else in their world of wealth and power had blood on their hands? The truth wasn't finished. She wasn't finished. Claire's grief hardened into resolve. If Ethan had spent years hunting the ghosts of his past, perhaps it was time she hunted hers. Her father's empire, his allies, his secrets. None of it would remain buried. A storm was brewing, and Claire was at its center. Claire sat at her kitchen table, the dim glow of the overhead light casting deep shadows across the room. Her hands trembled as she reread the letter, the one she had agonized over before slipping it into the mail. It was done. She had forgiven him, and yet, a hollow weight remained in her chest. Across town, Detective Harris scrutinized the case file, his brows furrowed in frustration. Something didn't add up. The man Claire had chosen to forgive, the same man responsible for shattering her world, had vanished. No known whereabouts, no digital footprint. Only whispers and loose ends. Justice wasn't served, and Harris couldn't shake the feeling that Claire's mercy was a dangerous thing. Meanwhile, in a shadowed motel room, Ethan sat in silence. The walls were peeling, the air heavy with the scent of damp carpet and cigarette smoke. He held Claire's letter, rereading it with shaking fingers. She had forgiven him, but forgiveness was never enough. The past had its own way of dragging a man down, drowning him in the weight of his sins. And Ethan knew, no matter how far he ran, justice would find him. The next morning, Claire stepped outside to find an unmarked car parked just beyond her driveway. She knew why it was there. Detective Harris had made it clear. Forgiving Ethan did not mean setting him free. The law would not be so merciful. A knock at her door made her stomach lurch. She opened it to find Harris, his expression hard but not unkind. "Claire, we need to talk." As she hesitated, the phone rang from inside the house. She turned, pulse quickening. She picked it up, and a distorted voice on the other end sent ice through her veins. "They're coming for me, Claire. I need your help." The line went dead. Claire's breath hitched. Outside, Harris watched her closely, reading the shift in her expression. He knew that look. He'd seen it before in cases where emotions clouded judgment, where sympathy walked hand in hand with danger. And in that moment, Claire realized she stood at a crossroads. Betray the man she had just forgiven, or risk everything to help him escape. But before she could speak, the sound of screeching tires filled the air, and the world around her erupted into chaos. The courtroom was suffocating with tension. Claire sat rigidly in the gallery, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles turned white. Across the room, Ethan stood at the defense table, his face etched with exhaustion. The charges against him were severe, the prosecution relentless. Forgiveness had been granted by Claire, but the law would not be so easily swayed. Detective Harris sat among the audience, his piercing gaze never leaving Ethan. He had fought tooth and nail to ensure justice was served, and yet something gnawed at him, an uncertainty that the man standing trial was beyond redemption. The defense lawyer, Jonathan Myers, was a seasoned legal mind, and today he was at his finest. He meticulously dismantled the prosecution's arguments, presenting compelling evidence that Ethan had not acted out of malice, but out of circumstances beyond his control. Witness after witness took the stand, some with tears in their eyes, painting a picture of a man haunted by regret, a man who had been punished enough by the weight of his own conscience. Every hearing was a battlefield. The prosecution painted Ethan as a dangerous man who should be locked away, while Myers presented a different reality, one where remorse, accountability, and rehabilitation mattered. The media feasted on the trial, sensationalizing every detail. Claire found herself bombarded by questions whenever she stepped outside. Did she still stand by him? Was she blind to justice? Was her forgiveness a betrayal of what was right? The weight of public scrutiny was unbearable, yet she remained steadfast. Then came the final verdict. All rise, the bailiff announced as the judge entered, his face impassive. A hush fell over the courtroom. Ethan's heart pounded. Claire's breath hitched. The judge's voice cut through the silence. After careful deliberation, taking into account the compelling evidence provided by the defense, this court finds the defendant. A pause. The world seemed to stop. Not guilty. A collective gasp filled the room. The prosecution looked stunned. Detective Harris clenched his jaw, and Claire, she exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Ethan turned to his lawyer, eyes wide with disbelief. He was free, but freedom did not erase the scars. As he stepped out of the courthouse, flanked by Claire and their children, reporters swarmed like vultures. Cameras flashed, questions flew, but none of it mattered. What mattered was the hand that slipped into his, Claire's. A silent promise that forgiveness was real. Days later, Ethan stood with his family at his late father-in-law's gravesite. The man he had wronged, the man whose absence would forever be felt. The burial was a solemn affair, yet there was peace in the air, a sense of closure. That night, as they sat around the dinner table for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Claire reached across and took Ethan's hand in hers. Their children looked at them with hopeful eyes. The past could not be erased, but the future, it was theirs to rebuild. And for the first time in years, Ethan truly believed he had been given a second chance.